Mixed martial arts. No one else talks about it. Except us. On the ball.
Dublin City FM.
Hello everybody and welcome to this week's MMA segment on the Ball. I am Neil Marshall, joined on the line by Kenny Murphy. We'll be talking all the week's latest news and show reviews in mixed martial arts, including 2 UFCs taking place this weekend. But first we're going to keep it local. Ryoshin Fighting Championship 6 took place last night in the Roadstone Sports Club in Dublin. So some of the quick results from that, it featured a middleweight tournament semi-final and final. So the semi-finals had Ben Forsyth defeating Johnny Bowden from Cockero MMA via decision, and Will Fury defeating Phil Fennell as well in the second semi-final via TKO. The final then saw Will Fury go on to capture the belt, defeating Ben Forsyth via rear naked choke in round 3. We also had a couple of title fights as well. In the welterweight title scene, Paul Lawrence defeated Jonathan Burns from Waterford MMA via guillotine in round 1, and Sam Slater, keeping the SBG winning streak alive, defeated Mailden Academy from Ryoshin Fighting Team via TKO in round 3. Finally, lightweight title fight saw Levi Kyo defeating Sam Simon from Waterford MMA via decision. A great night of fights. I believe there was 11 in total, and it's always nice to have a little bit of a tournament mixed in as well. So yeah, there you go. Good results and a good night had by all in attendance. Ken, how are you doing?
I'm splendid, Neil. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. The L tournament format. Have you ever been to a live show with one?
I have not. I'd say it's something of a car crash, though.
Really?
Yeah, I would just imagine it's a very difficult thing to run with all the potentials for injury. I mean, I don't know if you watched the Battlegrounds MMA show last month, but I think there was difficulties, people getting cleared after one fight for the next, and so there was big delays at times and just killing time.
Yeah, I do. Well, this one specifically was just 2 semi-finals and a final for the middleweight title. So
yeah, that's just when it's only 3 fights and at that stage, you can probably afford to have other fights on the card in between them, so that's kind of okay.
Yeah, exactly. I think it works out a little bit better. So Ryoshin supposedly had a really good show last night. Do you remember about a year and a half ago when there was literally a local show every week?
I do, yeah.
It was absolutely outrageous. At least they're keeping it steady now, and I guess with a lot of people trying to go abroad as well. Obviously, Cage Warriors have a lot of Irish fighters signed up, and they wouldn't be running shows every month even. It's every other month, it seems. But somebody who do run a tremendous amount of shows are UFC. They had 2 this weekend, one from Australia and one from Brazil. We'll talk about the Australian show first. It was essentially kind of Friday our time. The main event being Luke Rockhold against Michael Bisping. And we had a really good chat a couple of weeks ago about the legacy of Michael Bisping. I kind of threw it off as somebody who's basically a 50-50 fighter at best. And you gave the explanation that, well, if you take every fight on its merits, this guy has done very well considering the unfair advantages other people had.
Absolutely, yeah.
Did Luke Rockhold's advantage just be the fact that he's a better fighter?
Yeah, I think that if you remember the Tim Kennedy fight, which Bisping lost by decision, when he was just out wrestled for 5 rounds, there was a feeling after that fight, certainly from watching it, I had the feeling that perhaps Bisping was done as a top level fighter. He'd been off for a year, and he'd had all the eye issues, and since then he's had the Kung Lee fight where he looked great, but Kung Lee is whatever 55, 65 years of age, so so this was the real test as to whether or not he was still able to go at the top level. And sadly, despite sporting a magnificent beard, which I argue should add years onto his career, his fighting was just not top notch here. He was being beaten to the punch everywhere, and he got knocked down, which is not something that would regularly happen to a prime Bisping, and he got submitted with a single arm guillotine, which is unique in itself. And also, this is the first time he's ever been submitted. So, for me, that's the end of him as a top level fighter. He should, the UFC should be smart enough to give him a fight he can win next. You know what I mean? And not put him in there with a Jacare or someone at the top level. Put him in there with a top 15, top 20 guy, but not a top 10 guy. Because he can be a superstar. He can make big money for you in the UK, but no, he was. It just wasn't a competitive fight, was it? Really?
No, as Ken said, the finish was a one-armed guillotine choke, which is just, it kind of almost looked effortless in a way. Obviously he was using leverage with his other arm, but it was, it was a really, really good finish 1 minute into the second round. It got Luke Rockhold the performance of the night honors. So if we look at his record, Ken, the only UFC defeat he's had was against Vitor.
Yeah,
so,
and I think at this point in time, we have to wait and see how Vitor fares against Weidman. But if Vitor gets blown out as badly as most of us expect, I think you can almost take the fights with Dan Henderson, Michael Bisping, and Luke Rockhold that got him to the title fight, and almost just for the opposition, just kind of put an asterisk next to them and not really count them, because it's. There's been a lot of guys who've used testosterone in MMA, and it's been documented, but there's nobody who underwent a physical transformation like Vitor Belfort, and who could just completely turn his career around like he did. And here's somebody who'd already failed for steroids, so God knows what else he was using.
Mm-hmm.
It just felt like this was somebody who was a completely different fighter because he was using. So go on anyway.
Yeah, well, my point being, on his lead into the UFC, he had a tremendous, I think it was like a 7 or 8 fight win streak. Maybe, was it 9? I'm not too sure. But basically,
we're talking about Rockhold here.
We're talking about Rockhold, and he left Strikeforce as the middleweight champion.
Yes,
lost to Vitor.
And he wants that rematch, by the way.
He wants that rematch. Well, look, listen, all I'm saying is, looking at his record and looking at who he lost to, surely his name has to be close to the mix now.
Yeah, I think that before last night, the consensus was that Jacare Souza would be next. Now, Rockhold did call out Jacare after his fight here, so that could well be next. I would hold off because I think you're kind of killing off one of the two top contenders if you do that fight. I think they both are worthy of a championship match, and I think in that division, I don't see anybody else emerging who I would be content to put in there. Like you said, he went. Luke Rockhold had 9 fights in Strikeforce over his Strikeforce career, and he won all 9 of them.
Yeah.
He lost to Vitor Belfort, but since then he TKO'd Costa Philippou, he submitted Tim Boach, and he submitted Michael Bisping. And those 3 guys, Philippou, Boach, and Bisping, those guys don't lose that many fights, but they definitely don't get finished that frequently. So, I think he's got a real strong case, and he's beaten Jacare. Let's not forget that. Jacare, when you look at the fights he's won of late, his fights in the UFC have been Chris Camozzi. I mean, what do you say about Chris Camozzi? Francis Carmone, Gegard Mousasi, and Yushin Okami. So, Okami is he's gone from the UFC and hasn't fared too great since. Mousasi was probably a decent style matchup for him, and Carmont and Camozzi, I mean, they're just not great shakes, and they've both been cut by the UFC. So I think that Rockhold probably has the stronger case right now, and maybe that's where you go.
Do you see him having more of a chance getting a shot if Weidman wins or if Vitor wins? For that? Because for some reason, I just think
I feel like.
I just think though, if somehow Vitor was to beat Chris Weidman, that they'd probably go an automatic rematch. No.
It depends. I mean, if you decisioned him and it was close, yes. But we'll just say, let's say Vitor does what he's done in his last 3 fights and he head kicks him and knocks him out in 5 minutes. There ain't no way they're rematching that. That's not how the UFC books. If you recall, it's when the UFC took over. When Zuffa took over from the previous ownership. That was the first thing they did, was get rid of the idea that a champion gets an automatic rematch, and they only really tend to do it when it's a close fight or a really, really long-term dominant champion. I mean, let's not forget, George St. Pierre didn't get an automatic rematch in 2006. So if he got knocked out, I don't think they would. But if he lost a close decision, then yes, they would probably go back to that fight.
Well, there's no denying that Luke Rockhold is in a very strong position now, and I guess we'll find out.
On this showing, I would have no qualms, saying, give him a title shot. Bisping is not, whatever we want to say about how Bisping may not be who he used to be, he's not somebody who just knocked down and submit with one arm like that. That was special. That was impressive. Looking
at the date of the Weidman-Vitor match in February, though, I wouldn't be surprised if they did put Rockhold against somebody else in the interim.
Yeah, you could maybe do. I mean, what was we know? You could very easily
do it on the same show.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and have almost like a mini tournament. That's definitely in the realms of possibility.
Excellent stuff. Okay, semi-main event. Alia Quinta defeated Ross Pearson via TKO punches in the second round. How do you think Ross looked in this?
I thought Ross was okay. It was a fairly even striking battle here. Ally Quinta, for those who don't know, is a training partner of Chris Weidman, who we were just speaking of.
Yep.
And he's a good fighter, and they talk very highly of him in the Sarah Longo camp. And the thing about the Sarah Longo camp is, the only fighter I've ever really heard them talk up was Chris Weidman himself, and they said he'd be the guy who knocked off Anderson Silva. So they don't speak highly of these guys unless there's a reason to speak highly of these guys, and they think the world of Ally Quinta. Now Al, he beat Rodrigo Dam in September, but before that he'd had a submission loss to kind of an unknown in May. So this was a big fight for him, and in a sense I think it was also a big fight for Ross, because Ross had some momentum. He'd beaten what's his name? Not Gray Maynard. So I think for Ross, he's always kind of been a 50-50 fighter in the UFC. I think if you look at his record in the UFC, he's had how many fights he had now? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. He's had 14 UFC fights,
Yeah.
And he's lost 6, drawn 1, and won 7. So I mean, it kind of keeps him where he's at. I don't think there's any point kidding yourself he's ever going to challenge for a championship, but his striking is lethal enough that he should always have a job, at least for another couple of years anyway.
Absolutely. Any other notes from that card itself?
I mean, it was a good card.
Yeah.
If you watched the whole thing start to finish, it was the first UFC show in a long, long time to be filled with finishes, at 11 finishes and 11 fights.
That's right.
I mean, Marcus Brimage won the opener. Marcus Brimage, of course, was Conor McGregor's first opponent in the UFC. But other than that, I don't think that there's a lot on the show that our listeners would have a great deal of interest in.
The awards were, as before mentioned, Luke Rockhold winning performance of the night, as did Lewis Smolka for his fight on the undercard. Fight of the night went to Robert Whittaker versus Clint Hesser, which was on the main card.
Good fight that.
Yeah, Robert Whittaker won with a TKO in 2 minutes 43 seconds of the second round. So moving on to the second UFC show of the weekend.
There's one thing I'd like to say about that actually is I don't know if we'll cover, but it's important to mention that the semi-main event of this show was supposed to be John Lineker against our good friend Ian McCall.
Yes.
And McCall made weight, but got very sick after weigh-ins and was hospitalised, and so the fight never happened, which is a real disappointment because it was probably very likely that this was going to determine the next challenger for Mighty Mouse Johnson. And of course, there's been the issues with Lineker missing weight in 3 of his 6 UFC fights, and so he made weight here. And I think had he won, he was going to get a championship match. And now, I mean, I don't know what you do with Mighty Mouse. He fights very frequently, which is great. The UFC needs champions that do that, but everyone beats him convincingly, and you're left kind of with no one else to fight him. So, and I always wonder when a guy is a tough weight cut and he misses the fight. I don't know how that looks if you're the UFC,
Yeah, no, exactly. It's a pity that this happened, because when you look at the card itself, besides the main event, it was the only thing that had name value and ramifications moving forward, as in direct ramifications. So
it's a big shame.
It really is. So first off, I guess we should talk about Ian McCall himself, and is there any update on how he is doing?
There is not. No, nothing really has come out. How sick he was, I don't know. I would assume he would have to be very sick to pull out of the fight.
Yes.
I don't know. I think there's a certain worry because of we've spoken in the past, his personal issues. He's had serious drug problems for a lot of his career, and not his career, his life rather. And I don't know. I suppose you do worry when a story seems to be kept hush hush, because nothing's really come out other than he was in hospital and he was sick. Nothing more than that has come out. So I don't know what the situation is with him.
It's kind of surprising that there hasn't been more weight issues with this division, it being the lightest division, for the men.
Well, to be fair, I mean, there has been, in the sense of, you look at a guy like Lineker. I don't think there's anybody in any other weight class at the moment in the UFC who's missed, half of his thing. There was also Henry Cejudo, the Olympic athlete, the Olympic gold medalist, who was to debut at 125 recently. He missed weight so badly that he didn't take the fight, and he's going to fight his debut now at bantamweight instead. So there certainly has been issues.
Do you see it being a problem moving forward? Like, is there enough talent bank that naturally,
I think, the UFC are talking about adding 115. I mean,
do you know anybody off the top of your head in mixed martial arts that could realistically comfortably fight at 115?
No, and what it is it's largely, and this is coming from the UFC themselves. This isn't a racial stereotype coming from me. In some of the markets that they want to break into, like particularly China, there's a huge population that would be around that size, and
that makes sense, I guess.
It does make sense, but at the same time, I mean, I don't know how big they ever will be in China, but I know that their bread and butter is in the States and in this part of the world, the Western Hemisphere, and I just don't know. I'll put it this way: we've seen people walk out and boo fights at 125 because people were just too small. Can you imagine two little Chinese lads who weigh, about half your body weight, and you're only a little fly anyway, Neil?
That's right.
I could not imagine the reaction of the people. Do you know what I mean?
I love the way that even though you call me little fly, you alluded to the fact that I'm 230 pounds. John Lineker, obviously,
it's all in your beard. It's all in his beard.
I'm clean shaven, Ken. I had to do it for my Halloween costume last week.
It's all in your mullet.
Oh wow. John Lineker obviously is going to be very disappointed by all this. What is going to happen for him to officially get a title shot? Who's he going to go against? Are they just maybe going to throw him in anyway?
I don't know. I know they made him make weight to get his show money, so they'll be happy with him that he actually made weight, because that's been such a problem with him.
Okay,
but, I think they'll probably try and reschedule this fight since Lineker didn't fight here. You know what I mean? There's no, unless there's a serious medical issue with McCall, it doesn't really make sense to find different opponents for the two of them. And I think that, I think that they're both. I think that's the fight to make for the next challenger. I mean, I know it's tough to do Johnson versus McCall 3 because the second one was quite one-sided, but that first fight was fantastic, and then McCall almost finished him in the third round. So I think it's a fight you can do, and obviously the Lineker fight. Lineker's looked real strong and would have had a championship match a long time ago if it wasn't for the fact that he couldn't make weight. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, we'll see what happens there moving forward. So let's talk about a fight that actually did take place on the Australian show, which was the main event. We had OSP against Shogun Hua. We spoke about Shogun's...
Neil, you said let's talk about a fight that did take place. I didn't see a fight.
Very good, Ken.
I saw one sided ass with OSP swinging the hammer.
Well, I was, first off, before we get to it, I was actually going to put you over in the sense that last week we spoke about the decline of Shogun Hua from being the champion to being somebody who is feared in the division as a contender to being somebody who just hasn't been the same since the Dan Henderson fight, and that was quite some time ago. You predicted that he wasn't going to come out victorious here. I don't think you predicted this, though.
To be perfectly honest with you, I when I was watching the fight, they show the odds on the graphic when they're introducing the fighters, and they saw that he was the favourite. I just was baffled. I just thought, here's a guy whose chin is going, who, was handled by Chael Sonnen, who is not exactly top level, and who, had nothing for Alexander Gustafsson. I just felt like I just look at Shogun rather, and I see somebody who looks like he shot. I mean, even physically, I don't think he's never been somebody who picked the most flattering of ring gear anyway. But seeing him out there in his tighty whities with his love handles hanging over the sides, it's just, it's not pleasant. And I mean, he went in here and, I like to be right, Neil. We both know I have a gigantic ego, and anyone who listens to our pro wrestling podcast will be aware of that. But I've never been so disappointed to be right here. It was really, really sad. I mean, for those who didn't see the fight, they kind of touched gloves. They went in the middle. They circled. Shogun leaped in with a right. He got caught with a right coming in from OSP. He collapsed to the ground, and OSP kind of knocked him out, then knocked him back in, then knocked him out, then knocked him back in, and the referee kind of let it go on maybe longer than he should have, and but the whole fight lasted, I think it was 27 seconds. So this is one of those where, and by the way, it was in Brazil, and there's still nothing stranger than when a Brazilian gets knocked out on a Brazil card, and the crowd just goes, dead silent. It's a quite spooky sensation, isn't it?
It is
really
spooky, and they were not happy here,
No.
and they didn't voice their unhappiness, which, as you said, was spooky. It was a weird one. Do you think that Hua would have slightly more success if he kind of changed his moniker to Saturday Night Shogun Hua?
Shogun Hua. I think
Or Shogun Saturday Night, even.
Maybe he might have maybe Shogun Wedding. I don't know. He might have a career after fighting, but no. But being serious here, I think both him and Dan Henderson. Look, thanks for the memories, but it really is time to do something else with your life, because this is just. What did you think watching this fight?
Oh, it was the end, and like it's gonna sound like I'm just taking off what you said, but when I saw the way he looked. It's just, it's very obvious. It's very obvious sometimes, and I just like it's just a perfect example, Ken, of a guy on the up and a guy on the decline. And more times often than not, I guess Tito, 2 years back with that shock victory over who was it, Ryan Bader?
Yes, it was. Yeah.
Like, just very rarely does it happen that you get the upset. When one guy is so clearly moving one direction and the other guy the opposite, and that was it. You know what I mean? And this is what Shogun will now be. I'd say he'll be somebody who primarily fights in Brazil, and I don't think it will be in any way against people on the up in that division. And I don't see him fighting very regularly anymore.
Do you know what I thought was perhaps the most telling thing here? The age gap between these two fighters is 7 months. Shogun is 7 months older than Owen Preux, and I think in the cage they looked, I'd say, a decade apart.
That is just incredible. And when you look at PJ Polacco, when you look at the win record, or I guess the amount of time in the sport, how much of a difference is there? I obviously
That's
Shogun's
the thing.
been
Well,
around
I always
long.
think with a fighter, it's not age. A fighter is like a car; it's miles on the clock.
Absolutely.
And he has 32 fights, and he's been in wars. But I always think sometimes you can look at a fight and there's just a turning point. And fighting is like no other sport in the world, because you can literally just one day go from being world class to being a bum. And if you go back to the fight with John Jones, where he just got pounded for 3 rounds and there was just no let up. You remember, like in the end, he actually tapped. When the referee stopped it, Shogun wasn't aware he was stopping it. He tapped to strikes on the ground.
Yeah.
And since that fight, he's had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He's had 8 fights and he's only won 2 of them. And one of them was against Brandon Vera. So. He's just been declining. I think that took a lot off his chin. And, even the Dan Henderson fight at the end of 2011, he still had a chin, he still had a jaw at that point. But then you fast forward to 2.5 years later when he fought Hendo again, he dominated Hendo for 2.5 rounds. And then, if you recall, Hendo literally just clipped him with one shot. And, granted, Hendo has power, but Shogun was out. He was cold. And then the same thing here. And it's the same thing longtime fans will remember Chuck Liddell going through. When your jaw is gone, you have no place fighting people with 4-ounce gloves in a 20-foot cage. It's dangerous. You will do long-term damage to your health. We don't want to end up. We don't want to see guys ending up punch drunk like Sylvester Stallone in Rocky, or for that matter, Sylvester Stallone in real life.
James Toney. Okay, finally, before we let you go, Ken, Fabricio Verdum and Mark Hunter fighting for what they're calling the interim heavyweight title. Might as well be just for the heavyweight title, though, looking at Kane. And who do you think is going to take it?
Could we not talk about the major fight of next weekend, the Tito and Stefan, before we go off the air, Neil?
Of course we can. Okay, give me your pick here.
Verdum.
Okay, now last week I brought up Tito and Stefan just for the laugh. Has the buzz enwrapped you more? Has Noel Keeley been on the phone? Are you thinking that this is going to be like one hell of a show? This should be on the big screen in Domangos, as far as I'm concerned. This is going to be a fun fight. It is. It's 2 big stars. It doesn't matter in any way. I think there should be more fights like this in MMA. I don't know why the UFC is so keen to cook guys who are stars and who have longevity. You know what I mean? People would rather watch these 2 guys fight if it was on Fox on a Saturday night than say, I don't know, who was the last Fox show? I think it was Ben Henderson and Rustim Habilov. You know what I mean? There you go.
it's two names, and we've seen that with Quentin Rampage Jackson and BJ Penn both drawing big on Fox when they were long past their athletic peak.
Yeah.
So I think that I'm going to go with Stefan here. Just because Tito has just looked like such a bum in the last 7 or 8 years, but no confidence in that pick either. You?
I don't know. It came out this week that Tito wasn't in on the whole unmasking thing.
Yeah, I'd heard that from day one that it was just Stefan and Justin shooting their own angle.
So maybe Tito is maybe it's just up his dander enough that he's going to pull it out.
I'm hoping for the People's Champ to pull it out here.
I presume it will. Well, look, we'll be talking about both those shows, UFC 180 and Bellator, Bonner versus Tito, next week. Until then, thank you very much for being on the line, Ken, as always. Thank you, everybody, for listening. If you missed any of this segment, you can go on to thisaintfake.com tomorrow to catch it in our archives. Our archives also include all the past episodes of MMA on Dublin City FM and our pro wrestling podcast, which comes out every Thursday. It's thisaintfake.com. So our archives for MMA and wrestling podcasts are all up at thisaintfake.com. If you are just an MMA fan and you'd like to listen live, we'll be back at the same time next week here on 103.2 FM.